The legendary Book of Enoch is often viewed as esoteric or even blasphemous. The book consists of 5 separate but very related works, the most famous of these being the Book of the Watchers. The book itself, usually referred to as First Enoch, is not the main focus of this video, however. While most churches around the globe do not accept the text as canonical, the Ethiopian church does. So today, we will be exploring how this often misunderstood text became part of the Ethiopian canon. Join me as I discuss the canonization of First Enoch. In the Bible, very few people are said to physically ascend to heaven. For example, this happened to Elijah in 2 Kings 2:11-12. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel! And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garment and tore it in two. Probably the most interesting account of ascension in the Bible comes from very early in the narrative. Enoch is said to live 365 years, in which he walked closely with God for 300 of those until he disappeared because God took him. Genesis 5:24. Rather than a full exegesis, the topic of this video is this: how did First Enoch become canon in the Ethiopian church? Before diving further into the history of the canonization of First Enoch, we must first discuss the difference between canon and scripture. Scripture includes works that a person or community often see as God-inspired or authoritative. On the other hand, canon is a closed book of scripture. Before the notion of canon arose, distinct communities had their own sets of scriptures that sometimes differ wildly. In the Western tradition, biblical canon is easily understood as a closed book of scripture. However, the Ethiopian Orthodox view canon to be a bit more fluid. Not so fluid, however, to be considered simply as scripture. In fact, in the Ethiopian church, there exists a broader canon and a narrower canon. While the canon lists generally add up to 81 and are often said to be 81, sometimes the books numbered in the Old Testament are 46 and 35 in the New Testament. This is the broader canon. The narrower canon consists of 54 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. Tedros Abraha notes that, in both, the number of books is 81, with the difference that the narrow canon does not include books not recognized outside of Ethiopia, and reaches the number 81 through a particular calculation. The fluidity of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon can clearly be seen, but why is First Enoch considered a part of this intricate puzzle? Tertullian, a 2nd century church father for example, at a time when the notion of canon had already come into being, argues for the authoritative value of First Enoch. In his On the Apparel of Women, while acknowledging the fact that plenty of people did not accept First Enoch as scripture, he argues that it might have been Noah who was responsible for the ultimate preservation of the work. According to him, one of the biggest qualms that believers had with First Enoch was that it could not have survived the flood. But Noah was the great-grandson of Enoch, and Enoch's instruction to his son, Methuselah, was to preserve the book and hand it down to the generations. 1 Enoch 82:1. Tertullian further argues his position by pointing out that the Epistle of Jude cites Enoch. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone, and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts that they have committed in their ungodliness, and of all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Jude 14-15. Not only is this a direct quotation of 1 Enoch 1:9, but by the use of the term prophesied, we can conclude that the author of Jude viewed 1 Enoch as scripture. So too did Tertullian. In fact, there were many early church fathers that argued 1 Enoch should be considered scripture. Many of them also noted that 1 Enoch was not considered to be divinely inspired in much of the church. For example, the 2nd century theologian Origen noted in his work against Celsus that Celsus In a most confused manner, moreover, does he adduce, when examining the subject of the visits of angels to men, what he has derived, without seeing its meaning, from the contents of the Book of Enoch. For he does not appear to have read the passages in question, nor to have been aware that the books which bear the name Enoch do not at all circulate in the churches as divine, although it is from this source that he might be supposed to have obtained the statement that 60 or 70 angels descended at the same time, who fell into a state of wickedness. Furthermore, the Church Father St. Augustine, in his 5th century work The City of God, tells us in relation to Enoch that the writings of these men could not be held as authoritative either among the Jews or us, on account of their too great antiquity, which made it seem needful to regard them with suspicion, lest false things should be set forth instead of true. For some writings which are said to be theirs are quoted by those who, according to their own humor, loosely believe what they please. From this, and other extant writings, it seems to me that the reason 1st Enoch was not included in the Western Church canons boils down to tradition. Most believers in those churches simply didn't accept its divinity because they were suspicious of its great antiquity, and therefore did not regard it as authoritative. To begin examining the influence of 1st Enoch in Ethiopia, I will first summarize the Book of Enoch. 1st Enoch itself, as discussed in the introduction, consists of 5 works. The theme and plot of the book's modern form can be summarized this way. Enoch is given a series of revelations about the coming judgment in the kingdom of heaven. In the book, we are told about the fall of the Watchers. These were angels who came down to earth and taught a variety of crafts and magic arts. They also mated with human women, and their offspring had scattered throughout the land. God banishes these angels and locks them up in a celestial prison at the ends of the universe. In these visions, Enoch learns about the Son of Man, who is later identified as Enoch himself in 70:14. He learns about the divisions of the universe and the nature of heavenly bodies. He is also able to gaze upon Sheol and all its contents. Among other things, the antagonists in the book can be identified as the kings and the mighty. The work ends with a highly mythologized version of the birth of Noah and another description of the coming judgment. Judaism itself, and Christianity for that matter, had existed in Ethiopia for a very long time. The introduction of Judaism into the region is not a settled matter. Some scholars believe that the Jewish community, now identified as Beta Israel, formerly referred to as the Falashas, came to Ethiopia during the Second Temple period. Others believe that the modern Beta Israelites are descendants of Jewish converts who joined the religion much later. I am far from an expert on Beta Israel, but from the sources I have reviewed, it seems like the most likely explanation is the former. While I could easily be wrong, the fact that Beta Israel's calendar is, in part, based on the astronomical Book of Enoch is telling of the early beliefs and scriptures of the group. It's clear that the community of Axum saw itself as having great antiquity. This is seen especially from the Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of the Kings. According to this 14th century work, while the Queen of Sheba was visiting Solomon, they had conceived, and on her way back home she bore Menelik I, a legendary first king of Ethiopia. After reaching adulthood, he traveled back to Jerusalem to receive his father's blessing. Solomon did not want Menelik to travel home alone, so he sent an entourage with his son to help him back to Ethiopia. The elders that went with stole the Ark of the Covenant, and eventually the Ark found its way to Ethiopia. To this day, the Ethiopian Church still claims that they have the real Ark of the Covenant. The story of the Kebra Nagast contains many references to biblical literature, including 1st Enoch, which shows the importance of the work early in the nation's history. While the introduction of Judaism into the Kingdom of Axum is still somewhat shrouded in mystery, the introduction of Christianity to the empire is fairly clear. In the 4th century, a freed slave, Frumentius, converted the king of Axum, Ezana, to Christianity. From there, the religion was spread and integrated into the greater Axumite society. Getatchew Haile notes that the Monophysites who rejected the Christological definition issued by the Council of Chalcedon also fled to Egypt, Arabia, and Abyssinia, and thus contributed greatly to the diffusion of Christianity throughout the Axumite Empire. Over the next 1,000 years, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the empire. As has happened at so many points in history, divisions began to arise, the most prominent of which happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. Abba Georgius, an Ethiopian monk, had written extensively on the subject of the Sunday Sabbath, arguing that there were hints of this practice in the Torah. His arguments and recreated calendar are long and drawn out, so they will not be covered here. If you would like to learn more on his theological outlook on the calendar, I suggest reading Basil Laurie's paper on the subject. In fact, his argument for the observance of the Sabbath along with the Lord's Day would be a top issue of the Church in the following decades. The importance of the calendar to this discussion is the fact that it was partly based on the calendar in 1st Enoch. Furthermore, in his work, Mashafa Mistir, the Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth, Abba Georgius quotes or alludes to the Book of Enoch multiple times. For example, Georgius states that the watchers came down from heaven, and after they had put on the flesh of men, the madness of sin seized them, and they were thrust aside from the mysteries which they had seen in heaven. This is a direct reference to the Watchers myth in the first part of the book, where 200 angels, called Watchers, descend to earth and mate with human women. They taught humans metallurgy, astronomy, sorcery, and more. This was seen as an evil deed that led humans to sin and caused the ultimate imprisonment of the angels. There is also a retelling of the Apocalypse of Weeks in the Mashafa Mistir, in which the author reinterprets the story for events up to his own time. The influence of 1st Enoch is clearly seen, even at such a late date in the Church's history. Until the late 14th century, there was a great expansion of the Abyssinian domain. Expansion had been their primary goal, and in the meantime, there was a drastic change to monasticism in the area. In the 1330s, a new sect was being built. It was led by the monk Eustathios in Greek accounts. He became a monk when he was a young adult, and apparently left the country after an attempt on his life by rival clergy in 1337. Eustathios supported the view of upholding 2 Sabbaths. This included the Lesser Sabbath, the last day of the week on Saturday, and the Greater Sabbath, the first day of the week on Sunday. The Lesser Sabbath was celebrated by the Jews, while the Greater Sabbath was celebrated by the Christians of the time. Upon leaving Ethiopia, Eustathios entrusted leadership of his community to his senior disciple, Absadi. Initially, they established the community at Debra Maryam, but they eventually expanded into multiple communities across the land, and were almost completely independent of the church. 14 years later, some of the disciples that left Ethiopia returned with many books, and this promoted an active literary development. The so-called House of Eustathios kept growing, and their Sabbatarian views caused a problem for the anti-Sabbatarian parties of Ethiopia and Egypt. With the help of King DeWitt, Bartholomeos, the newly ordained bishop, attempted to bring unity to Ethiopia by bringing back the Alexandrian theologies. Eustathians were imprisoned, but DeWitt was forced to back off because of their continual growth and influence. After the Alexandrian ban on the Sabbath, the Eustathians grew so large in number that by 1404 they had taken over the entire Eritrean region. DeWitt had no choice but to grant them complete religious liberty. The controversies never quite subsided, but in 1434 a new king ascended that would change the face of the Ethiopian church forever. This was King Zar'a Yaqob, the youngest son of DeWitt. Taddesse Tamrat notes that an increasing number of people with varied cultural and religious backgrounds began to adopt the Christian religion, and by the middle of the 15th century, the additional responsibilities of the church were clearly beyond its educational and organizational facilities. He goes on to say that Zar'a Yaqob came to power at this crucial period and set himself the vital task of reforming the Ethiopian church. Previously, we discussed the Sabbatarian views of Georgius. He was an influential member of the court of DeWitt, so when Zar'a Yaqob ascended, the court was effectively infiltrated by the pro-Sabbath party. More than just a king, Zar'a Yaqob was a theologian in his own right. He wrote multiple homilies in his time and instituted vast religious reforms in Ethiopia. These reforms are of great interest and merit a video of their own. Among these were the institution of the worship of Mary, attempts to end pagan religious practices, and even a decree for all Christians to be tattooed with Christian creeds and wear religious symbols on their clothes. The effect of these reforms on the Estifanosites sect is especially noteworthy, so Getatchew's Haile paper on the topic is recommended. Probably his grandest endeavor was the organization of a council in 1450 to end the Sabbatarian controversy in Ethiopia. That year, the council gathered at Dabra Metmak, and the king ruled in favor of the Eustathian monks, who had preserved many Jewish traditions in their liturgy and practice. Of his religious writings, the most pertinent one to this discussion is the Mashafa Malad, the Book of the Nativity. In this work, he discusses many topics, including his Trinitarian views and the authority of 1st Enoch. Building on the many discussions on the astronomical book that came before him, including the calendars of Beta Israel and Georgius, Zar'a Yaqob had quite a lot to say on 1st Enoch and its importance. Here are just a couple quotes translated by Nickelsburg and Vanderkam. "Listen, unbeliever, whether Christian or Jew. Without the Book of Enoch, nothing is possible for you. A Christian cannot be a Christian, and a Jew cannot be a Jew. How do both of you, Jew and Christian, know your Easter, your Passover, the first of your month, your festivals, your years, your weeks, and all the signs of the sky, so that you may understand? Of what are you capable of knowing without the Book of Enoch? If a person comes from the east or west, from the north or south, or from the ends of the wide world, he is able to make no computation about his fast, his Easter, or his festivals according to the sun, moon, or stars without Enoch." Why was 1st Enoch so well received by Zar'a Yaqob and the greater Ethiopian community? Some quick points can be outlined here. First, the story of the Watchers breeding a world of demons was easily integrated into the traditional religion of the area, in which spirits and demons were part of everyday life. Second, its developed angelology also fit well into such a worldview. And third, in a country filled with mountains and ravines, Enoch's journey to the great mountain ranges must have left the reader feeling like they were reading about familiar terrain. The high regard in which Zar'a Yaqob held 1st Enoch should be blatantly obvious. Curiously, in 1442, Zar'a Yaqob sent a copy of Synodos to the Ethiopian community in Jerusalem. Synodos is a collection of 4th or 5th century early church orders that are attributed to the apostles and was translated into Ge'ez, the language of the Ethiopian church, in the 13th century. It is a canonical book that consists of 4 separate books and is part of the broader canon of the Ethiopian church. The reason that this book is such an interesting thing to be sent by Zar'a Yaqob is that, while it does claim an 81-book canon, it does not include 1st Enoch in the list. An 81-book canon is also maintained by the Fetha Nagast, Law of the Kings. This 13th century legal work might have been brought into Ethiopia during the reign of Zar'a Yaqob. It has long been noted that while the book claims 81 books, the actual list does not total 81, leaving quite a lot of confusion on its division of books. The Fetha Nagast was the standard legal code in Ethiopia up until the early 20th century during the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie I. The reason this is so intriguing to me is that the list in the Fetha Nagast does not include 1st Enoch. Apparently, this wasn't a problem for the Ethiopian Orthodox of the 20th century. An Amharic commentary on the work from 1958 gives an interesting apologetic for its omission. If one asks why does the Fetha Nagast leave out the Book of Enoch from the list, the reason is as follows. Enoch fell near paradise and stayed for 6 years, where, reaching perfection, he had revelation on the exit of winds, on the movement of stars, and on the atmosphere. Had the apostles included the Book of Enoch in the list of sacred books, philosophers would have said, "The apostles have not criticized our wisdom. It is for this reason that they have included the Book of Enoch in the list." In order to avoid such a conclusion, the apostles did not include the Book of Enoch in the list. Yet, in order to show that the Book of Enoch is an important book, the apostle has confessed on its account. The author then continues by quoting Jude 14 and Hebrews 11:5. Haile Selassie I, in 1935, published a new Amharic translation of the Ethiopian Bible. Sadly, most of the copies have been lost. Later, in 1962, a new translation was published, still under Selassie, that was worked on by a Bible committee in the preceding decades. This new translation of the Bible included the canonical books the West knows today, but books like 1st Enoch were published separately to establish the entire broader canon. From all this, it's clear that 1st Enoch was a highly revered book by some early church fathers, but the community at large didn't see it the same way. The strong Jewish community in Axum, along with the medieval writings that we discussed, played a key role in the later canonization of 1st Enoch. The period of Zar'a Yaqob's religious reforms and the controversies that came before truly solidified 1st Enoch as a staple of canon in the Ethiopian church. Nicolsburg concludes that, among other reasons, 1st Enoch took root in Ethiopia because its worldview spoke to the Ethiopians' worldview, and the environment it imaginatively portrayed resonated with their environment. Thanks for watching. If you haven't yet, be sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoy our content and want to help support this channel, check out our Patreon and Teespring links in the description. If you don't want to spend money but still see what we're doing outside of YouTube, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.